everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, hosted by HRDQU and presented by Rick Lefsinger. My name is Sarah. I'll moderate the webinar today. It will be about an hour, and if you have any questions, you can always type them into the questions box. We'll be answering these questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or in an email if we do run out of time. And then also note that we have handouts for this webinar. They can be located in the Handouts tab in your dashboard. So welcome, Rick, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thanks very much for joining us for today's session. Today, we're going to focus on what it takes to ensure that your cross-functional, multifunctional teams are working at high levels of performance. Sometimes we refer to these teams as matrix teams, but interestingly enough, a lot of people don't like to use that word. For some reason, the word matrix has sort of a negative connotation, and many people will talk about the matrix as an organizational structure that doesn't work. The issue here is that any structure has its downsides, has its upsides. The matrix structure has a number of advantages, which we'll talk a bit about, but this whole idea of being able to work effectively across the organizational boundaries is key to organizational success. When we did the research for my book, Closing the Execution Gap, one of the things we found, although we knew that cross-functional teams were important, but we also were able to find and discovered that working effectively across organizational boundaries was one of 5 key differentiators for the organizations that are most effective at executing strategy, being able to translate strategy into actual business results. In addition to that, when you're working in a multifunctional matrix team, it's not unusual that you are probably also working in a virtual environment, and our study on virtual team effectiveness also helped highlight some of the factors that are required for multifunctional, cross-functional teams to be effective. So we'll be drawing on information from both those studies and both those books. So the focus for today's session is we'll talk a little bit about how cross-functional teaming has evolved. I'll only spend a moment on that just to give you a sense of context, because again, cross-functional teams have been around for several decades. We'll talk about the benefits and challenges of cross-functional teamwork, and I'll spend most of the time on the 4 prerequisites. What are the foundational elements that are necessary to ensure that your cross-functional teams are operating at a high level and there's high degree of cooperation and collaboration. And then I'll use the work that we did with Hyundai Capital as a way to illustrate how these concepts can be applied and how they overcame the challenges for cross-functional teaming when they were focused on building their global business network. So just a brief history, the matrix structure working across organizational boundaries has been around for like, I don't know, 5 decades. It started in the aerospace industry. The whole NASA thing with getting a person on the moon was really the driver for looking for more efficiencies to be able to make the organization work more effectively, especially when dealing with an enormous, complex project that the traditional hierarchical structure really could not accommodate in any meaningful way. Then in the 70s and 80s, as organizations became more global, the matrix structure also started to become more visible when you had product managers, country managers, region managers, customer account managers, all needed to be able to work together across functional lines as well. And then in the 80s and 90s, the utility industry, chemical industry started to adopt the matrix structure because they were looking for economies of scale overall. And there have been some some examples of organizations that have done a good job with it. Most of these organizations are multinational in size, where the matrix became a driving force. This is the classic matrix. This is sort of the traditional matrix. This is what we think of when we think of the matrix. There was a time where, when focusing on the organizational structure, when you were doing large projects where each one of these functional groups would just sort of hand things off. So work would start with one functional group. They'd do what they had to do. They'd hand it off to the next group. They'd do what they had to do. They'd hand it off to the next group going forward. The problem here is that there were quite a bit of inefficiencies because one group was not necessarily talking to the other group. So if there was a problem over here that was caused by something done over here, they would then just have to hand it back over and basically start from scratch, which was highly inefficient. So the matrix structure basically got all the key players together in one place on one team. So everybody was hearing the same thing at the same time, was focused on the same thing, and that information that might impact the group downstream, they had input upstream before for the upstream group to be able to deal with it before it got too far down. So this added quite a bit of efficiencies. It was much more scalable, and it enabled people to deal with larger scale projects. So here you had horizontal as well as vertical coordination. You had alternate authority figures, not just a hierarchical power structure. Frequently, people had two or maybe more bosses, which can make it a bit more difficult to operate effectively, but there were real opportunities to efficiently share resources, to share expertise, and to avoid running into downstream problems, having to repeat work that was already done. As technology became more prevalent, we started to move from that grid structure to more of a network structure in terms of cross-functional teaming and cross-functional collaboration. So over the last, let's say, 10 years or so, it's been more, there have been fewer formal ties between matrix partners, and it's just been more opportunistic, a little bit more ambiguity regarding who your cross-functional teammates are, and it may be just ad hoc, or you're trying to figure out who do I really need to interact or engage with. You do have a greater access to subject matter experts, more fluid, there's a less formal structure, and it has put a greater degree of importance on maintaining lateral relationships, improving collaboration and cooperation overall. So what that generally looks like is this could be a diagram of what the matrix looks like today. It really is just a whole network of informal structures, although many people may still operate in a more formal matrix structure. A lot of our cross-functional teaming can be more ad hoc, more opportunistic, based on an immediate need or a particular situation. So the overall benefits, and I've spoken to a few of these. Why is the matrix attractive? And I would also suggest to you that it's not whether you like the matrix or don't like the matrix, whether you think it works or whether you don't think it works. The nature of business today, the competitive nature, the global nature of business today, the complexity of business today really does require the adoption of more cross-functional teaming and more formal matrix structures. So you can see the list here of the intended benefits, and intended is in quotes because we don't always realize it, but you can focus on multiple business goals simultaneously. You get a lot of economies of scale and the reduction of cost overall because you're not replicating functions and groups around the world, but rather having more centralized shared services overall. It can streamline work processes. You get people out of a silo thinking about the broader organization, the ability to share best practices, again, rather than having to replicate, you can share them across the system where they're needed. You're able to really focus on key customer requirements, much more responsive. And that's the whole driver behind the matrix. In theory, it is much more responsive than a traditional hierarchical structure where information has to move up the chain, then across the chain, then down the chain. You're getting decisions and actions closer to where the activity is overall. And of course, there are challenges in terms of working in the matrix. Probably not too surprisingly, lack of clarity on goals and priorities. Each group or function represented on the team has their own particular agenda, their own particular goal. And again, it's not wrong. It's just, this is our functional goal, and finding alignment can be difficult. The lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities about who does what. In addition to that, the lack of clarity on decision authority, where it becomes not just ambiguous, but generally just a lot of disagreement about who makes the call. When you've got a group of colleagues working together, nobody is clearly the boss, then it's difficult to say who decides, which functional group, which department, which region makes the call for a particular activity or decision. The need to share resources, when previously many functions controlled all their resources, now they have to share them. There could be conflicting loyalties between your functional group, where you get a lot of reward recognition, and the matrix team. Sharing decision making is sort of a new thing for a lot of leaders, either in a collaborative way, and you can't run things on a consensus decision making platform. So you got to figure out when and who to decide. And of course, there may not always be a lot of motivation to be able to make the matrix work. A lack of, when rewards and consequences are more in the functional group and not so much in the matrix group, it makes it more difficult to get people aligned overall. So let's open up a quick polling question and just check in with you guys and see which one of these 5 factors are your primary challenges. And I think you can check as many as might apply. So if you would do that now, please, which of these, conflicting unclear goals, unclear roles, ambiguous or shared authority, shared resources, siloed employees, which tend to be your greatest challenges? Let's see what we have here. So we'll leave it open just for a few more moments. Maybe till we get about, let's see if we get about 75% of the votes in. Yeah, we're up to like 60 or so. Let's give you guys a chance to vote. Okay, why don't we close it down now, please? Okay, let's see what we got. Okay, so it looks like the primary one, and not by a lot, is the silo-focused employees, conflicting loyalties. Oh, sorry. The conflicting loyalties, which probably, and right behind that is unclear roles and responsibilities, and then right behind that is conflicting. The least, the challenge that was selected least often was the shared resources. That does not seem to be an issue or a problem, but the others are pretty close. All 4 are within a few points of each other. So let's take a look and see what it takes to be able to make this matrix structure work, to be able to build cooperation and collaboration across organizational boundaries. And there are 4 key prerequisites, which pretty much align with some of those challenges overall. It's about ensuring that shared goals and common grounds are in place, clear roles and responsibilities, but more importantly, clarity on decision authority or decision rights, transparency, timeliness of communication, and standardization of work processes or some form of shared work processes. The idea here is that these structural elements really are the foundation. And the assumption, and I think based on our research, is that even if people are highly skilled, if they're great at influencing and managing conflicts and communication, even if they have those soft skills, without these key structural elements in place, despite the competency on the skill side, the team will still struggle, right? You'll be good at it, but you're going to have a lot of conflicts to manage. You'll be good at it, but there's a lot of influencing and gaining support going on. But it decreases the efficiency of the team overall. So we'll talk about each one of these 4 elements. So let's start with shared goals. This is all about getting people aligned. It's about creating a shared purpose overall. It's shared goals that makes cooperation and collaboration desirable. This is what pulls the disparate groups that make up this matrix team, this cross-functional team. It's some shared goal beyond what their functional department silo goal is that pulls them together and makes it desirable to try to collaborate and cooperate. It also provides encouragement and motivates people to communicate problems, allowing for faster resolution of issues overall. And because you have shared goals, you can then provide more autonomy and empowerment, and less monitoring is required, the thinking, because everyone is focused on achieving the shared goal, and that's the driver overall. So how do you do it? The key here is to clarify the matrix goals before you lock in the functional goal, the department goal, or the regional goal. And that seems to be the key. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. You also want to ensure that goals are being coordinated horizontally to make sure that they are both mutually supportive and aligned. And you want to make sure that you're reviewing and making adjustments periodically. This needs to be an ongoing process, a formal process, not an ad hoc, opportunistic, let's sort of do it today thing, but it needs to be the way goals are developed and agreed to. And by the way, if you don't have a hard metric, although you'd like to have the metric, that's the best, but if you don't have a hard metric, you're focusing on some shared value or some shared belief, some commonality that pulls the group together, like safety, quality, outperforming the competition, exceeding customer demand, something that would get the group focused together, right? So here's a chart. I put a little diagram together to try to visualize what this work would be. So if you take a look up at the top here, where it's not, where you see number one, you have the normal cascading down. That's where your goals would normally cascade down as you would expect. The idea being that they would then go to the strategic business units as normal, and then down to the functions. What we're suggesting here is that before it goes from the strategic down to the business units, down to the functions, and then as an afterthought, let's now think about the matrix teams, because the problem with that is that once the business unit goals are locked in and the functional goals are locked in, when you then try to allocate resources, either time or equipment or dollars to the matrix team goals, it's much, much more difficult because everything's already been locked and loaded. So the idea would be is that they cascade down, the strategic business units draft their goals, and the matrix teams are drafting their goals as well. And then there's the coordination between the two. So you get them a bit aligned before they cascade down. Once they cascade down to the functions also are coordinating across. And the idea being is, are we putting in enough capacity and focused on the kinds of work that need to be done to achieve both the strategic business unit goals and the matrix team goals? And then this process ends up iterating back and forth a bit, up and back, in order to make sure that priorities are set, because there may be some trade-offs, and or there's enough capacity to do the work that needs to be done. And you're trying to do this before you finalize the functional goals, because otherwise, even if I believe in what the matrix team is doing, I'm just less likely to be able to allocate time and resources or devote the energy that's needed, because I'm focused on where my rewards and recognition are, which tends to be on the function or business side. All right. All right, let me just. Right, so the next is clear roles and decision authority. And what you're doing here is not deciding just when my job stops and when your job begins or who does what work. You're really defining when cooperation is needed and what it looks like. And that's what role clarity is about. And that's what the decision authority is about. You're clearly stating this is when we need to cooperate, and this is what it looks like or how we need to cooperate. You're clarifying and ensuring that everybody knows what's expected of them, so you get an enhancement to accountability, and you're trying to clarify who's involved in solving problems and in making decisions. And you're doing this before you need to make the decision. In general, people tend to work better together when they're clear about boundaries and authority. It helps ensure that your processes better come together, and it ensures that nothing gets overlooked, that there's no duplication, and that things get completed effectively overall. So how do you do it? It starts with sharing job descriptions. If you don't know each other, it's, you need to know what everybody's doing and how they do it. But you also want to make sure that you work out the roles and decision authority in advance of having to make any key decisions or any activities. Just like with shared goals, you want to do that on the front end, because if you wait until you're confronted by the situation to then say, what's our common ground, what's our shared goal, it just slows everything down. Likewise, if you need to clarify roles and decision authority every time you come to a decision, you just miss the advantage of the potential speed of the matrix. So work it out ahead of time and involve the stakeholders in the discussion and deciding on what the roles and decision authority are. And once you do that, communicate it down through the organization, because it's not unusual for the senior people at the top of the matrix, to work it all out, but they don't send that message down through the front lines. So they tend to bump into each other and keep escalating things up. And everybody wonders why that's happening. So how do you do it? One way to do that is the use of the RACI model. And some of you may be familiar with this. It's about clarifying who's responsible and who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. And your definition of these terms, truthfully, it doesn't matter how you define them as long as everybody agrees. So from my standpoint, responsible is the person who's, let's think of it as the project manager, who's responsible for bringing people together and for moving information around the group, ensuring the right people are involved. Accountable would be the decision maker, right? Who makes the final decision. Consulted would be someone whose opinion needs to be solicited by the responsible party or the accountable party, but the consulted doesn't make the decision. And that's sort of where the RACI model breaks down a little bit. Everybody assumes that because I'm consulted, then I decide, but that's not the case. And informed is who needs to be told about a decision after it's made, because it impacts their work, but you don't necessarily have to involve them in the front end, right? So this basically, you chart it in some way where you've got the function or department that's involved, the decisions going across, and providing the role to each of those groups. And you'll notice that you're doing it for each key decision and each activity, right? The problem is that many times there's two things that go wrong, and many of you have probably bumped into this, is that either you try to chart everything, every possible decision or activity you could possibly come up with, which becomes mind-numbing and not particularly useful, or you don't involve the key stakeholders and make decisions for them, which doesn't have a lot of ownership, or everybody wants the A. Everybody wants to be accountable because they don't trust that another function will make the decision in everyone's best interest. They believe they'll make the decision in the best interest of the function they represent. So you get multiple A's, and if you have multiple accountabilities, then really you're just replicating the hierarchical structure where you have 3 or 4 people who have to reach agreement in order to move things forward. Once again, you're missing the potential speed of the matrix, and everything just slows down. So how do you ensure that the RACI model actually works and adds value? The key is to focus on the 3 to 5 most critical decisions. Using that 80-20 rule, don't try to chart everything. Chart the things that tend to be most important and most critical. By doing that, you then have a sort of a practice and a model So when you run into things that haven't been charted, then people have a model and a way and a vocabulary to talk about it. But focus on the 80%, the 20% of the decisions and actions that account for 80% of the work. Make sure you're involving the people who will need to execute and implement so they own it. And in order to avoid that problem of having everybody wants to be accountable, everybody wants to make the final call, you need to build and sustain high levels of trust. I need to believe that you're not only credible and understand the implication from my group as well as your group, but I also have to believe that you have a low self-orientation, meaning that your interests are for the team and not necessarily for yourself or your function. Make sure the next level down knows what the role agreements are so they don't bump into each other, and don't take it as a final carved in stone model. Review it, revise it as you gain experience with it. Make the adjustments that will ensure that the model works and adds value. The third area is improving communication, just making communication transparent. Now, some of this is really obvious and straightforward. Everybody needs the information they need to do their job. It minimizes contradictions and distractions. It enables everyone to work better together on problem solving. It informs planning and goal setting. It speeds up problem solving and decision making. It improves productivity and job satisfaction because everybody feels like they're in the loop and making a contribution. So how to do it? It's about creating formal communication plans that outline who has what information, who needs that information, and when do they need it. In addition to that, the consistent use of action plans. Now, I used to be hesitant to talk about this because I assumed that everybody did it until I found that it's not unusual. Many people don't use action plans. And the reason why they don't is they say, well, things change too fast. Well, for me, that's the reason you need an action plan, right? Think of action plans as a contract. They document agreements. They document expectations regarding who's supposed to do what and by when. So they facilitate communication because we know who to go to when we have a question about something. They facilitate communication when it comes to monitoring progress overall, and it allows you to monitor performance and progress going forward. You also need to make sure that the right people are involved. Now, this is not about the RACI model because you can't chart everything, but in the moment, as things come up, you need to be able to assess the situation and determine who do I need to involve around decision quality, who has a perspective and experience and knowledge that would help me make the best decision, and who do I need to execute and be committed to this role around implementation, right? And then, of course, just in general communication, make sure that you check for understanding of what the other person said before you take action or before you respond. Make sure, because a lot of times someone will say something, and especially if you're in a virtual team or a multinational team, it's not at all unusual for there to be some language or cultural differences, and the lack of visual cues can make communication a bit more difficult. So paraphrase, restate, check your understanding before you disagree and before you, in general, respond. That one act will improve communication dramatically. The last is around the standardization of work processes. Now, for multifunctional teams, again, you have multiple groups who do things a certain way. And just from this very simple chart, you can see that there are handoffs from one group to the other. And when work processes are not in some way aligned, everybody doesn't have to do it exactly the same way, but the points where they touch need to be aligned for a smooth transition. It can definitely slow things down, right? Or create real problems or create real mistakes overall. So you want to make sure that the process is shared, or at least the touch points are aligned for a smooth handoff. So the ways in which you can, why it's important overall, basically, it's all about economies of scale. If you're going to realize the sharing of resources across functions, the handoffs across functions, then you've got to have a better way to move that work and information across the groups. It ensures consistency and continuity. It improves workflow. It avoids overlap and duplication, enhances speed. It supports the sharing of information. It supports planning and goal setting, and it allows for shared performance metrics, right? It's the way to be able to measure the team as opposed to any one function's contribution to it. So some ways to go about that. It starts with taking a look at the core process at a global level and generally identify and agree on the core processes, and then use business process mapping, which is one of the lean tools that many of you are probably familiar with, to basically diagram the workflow, look for the roadblocks, the pinch points, look for opportunities for improvement, clarify responsibilities, and basically map it out. And then from there, you can make improvements as you need to. Then from the global level, you need to be sensitive to the local process, and that what's good at the global level may have variance down at the local level, and just establish those differences off of the standard process. Put in place a formal change management procedure, because once you start to use these processes, they'll be impacted by interaction with the customer. So, or even internal resources, they need to be adjusted on occasion as assumptions change and as competitive indicators change. So have a method to be able to make those adjustments to keep the core process and local variance aligned, and then establish some reporting capability to be able to monitor local variance in terms of cost and time frame overall. All right, so let's take a look at another polling question, and looking at each of these 4 prerequisites, which of the 4 are in place for your organization? We'll take that positive view. Which of these 4 are currently in place? And you can check more than one. I think you can check more than one if they are, but which ones are in place for your organization? And we'll wait till we get about 3/4 of the votes in at least. So get that vote in. Okay, so we're about halfway there. Let's get a few. Oh, this is interesting. Oh, we'll show you the pattern in a moment. Okay, just to give it a few more seconds. It's starting to even out a little bit. Okay, why don't we close it down? All right, so what do we have? It looks like the shared goals, common ground, 46% say that they currently have that in place. It's less than half. It's not a bad number, and it's better than a lot you might expect, but not very many. The next is standardized work processes. 35% have that. That's low, but it's one of the higher numbers. Clear roles and decision authority, only 10% said they have that in place, and transparency of communication, only 9% have that in place. So even though the shared goals is higher than I might have thought, it's still below 50%. There are opportunities to enhance performance of cross-functional teams by focusing on these 4 areas overall. If you've got shared goals, that's a great starting point, because that's the basis to be able to have all these other conversations, because it drives cooperation overall, working toward the same thing. All right, great. So let's just talk quickly about sustaining collaboration and cooperation and what the key skills are. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on each one, but these are basically 6 key skills. So you need to have the structural elements in place. But even with the structural elements, you're still going to have disagreements. It's the nature of things. As a matter of fact, out of disagreements, out of friction, out of conflict comes creativity, comes innovation. So it's not a bad thing. And people don't have authority. Even though you say, hey, I'm the decision maker, you still have day-to-day interactions where you need to gain people's commitment and support. So here are the key skills. It starts with building and sustaining trust. Trust is foundational. Without trust, it's very difficult to move anything forward, right? I need to believe that you're credible, know what you're doing. I need to believe that you're reliable, and I need to believe that you have the best interest of the team at heart. That's the basis for high levels of trust. And it's not just about suspending disbelief or hoping. You can actually build trust in a very proactive way. Influencing is a key skill because you're usually working with a group of peers and colleagues where no one has specific role authority, and being able to gain their support and commitment for your idea requires the effective use of influence. Conflict management is about resolving differences in an effective way. And again, having conflicts is neutral. It's not good or bad to have a conflict. It's how the conflict's resolved that's either good or bad. So skills are focused on the productive resolution of conflict. When and how to involve others in decisions, and being able to have a framework in your head to know when to involve people, usually around decision quality and decision acceptance, and be able to look at the team to decide who should be involved, because you can't chart everything in the RACI model, and you can't make every decision can't be a consensus decision. That's not a very effective way to run a business. It slows the whole team down. So you need to figure out the when and how of that. Emotional intelligence is about awareness of how your behavior impacts others and being able to read other people and respond appropriately, which is key to effective teaming. And of course, the interpersonal communication skills is the basis for the application of all these other skills. Good communication skills is a key element for influencing, for conflict management, for building trust, and for emotional intelligence. So these are the 6 skills overall. In conjunction with those 4 prerequisites, you're more likely to have a high-functioning cross-functional team. Let's take a look at a case work that we did with Hyundai Capital, where we were able to kind of illustrate how these concepts played out in real life. So Hyundai Capital, some of you may know, they are the financial services arm of the Hyundai Motor Group. And over the last maybe 10 or so years, Hyundai has tried to grow its footprint and not just be a provider of automobiles in Korea and China and in the East, but to move more globally. And along with that, Hyundai Capital has also grown in the US, the UK, Europe, Australia, Brazil, Russia, India, and it really is a global network. And in each of these regions, they're managed by what they're calling a global entity that with their headquarters in that region, but with matrix partners around the world and in Korea. So here's the problem, and this is why we were called in. Between each of the global entities in general and central headquarters, the Global Business Development Group, and Hyundai Motor Group, Hyundai Capital had a lot of challenges. And you can see there's like 4 entities here, 4 key groups. So there were cultural differences between the global entities and headquarters. And interestingly enough, that was the starting point for Hyundai. They basically said the reason why we're having problems here is because the Western entities don't really understand the Korean culture. So what we need to do is bring them in, educate them on the Korean culture, and everything will be okay. It turns out that there was also a misalignment of goals between Hyundai Capital, the global entities, and the Motor Group. Now, interestingly enough, the Motor Group, they're the manufacturing arm. they produced the car. And just a simple example, their goal was to make as many cars as possible. The Motor Group wanted to be like one of the top 3 automakers in the world, so they were just all about producing cars. The problem that created is that in each one of the global entities, they basically do the loan. They do the car loan or the to purchase or lease. And when the demand on them to sell and lease a lot of cars, it caused them to lower some of their requirements for the loan, and they started to take on poorer quality loans. So the home office would come back and say, the quality of these loans is terrible. But if they didn't agree to the loan, then the home office would come back and say, you're not moving enough steel. So they were caught in between, and the Motor Group didn't really care. Their goal was to make cars, and they were making cars. So it just put the capital services in a difficult situation. And they had a very complicated organizational structure. You can see there were 4 entities here, and the roles and decision authority was very unclear about what could the entities do on their own, when did they have to go to the global business development, when did they have to go to the headquarters, when did they have to go to the Motor Group, and it was very unclear about how decisions were made and why requests were being made. Requests were coming to the global entities. They didn't know why or who was asking for more financial information or asking them questions about performance. So it was creating some real challenges for the group to engage and interact, and it was really eroding trust. There were serious low levels of trust among these individuals around sharing information, being open and straightforward in general. So the solution, we started with a data-based approach. And the idea was to really understand what the factors were, what was in place that was supporting teamwork across functions, and where were some of the gaps. So we interviewed a cross-section of executives in all of the groups overall to get a better idea about the challenges for working in that matrix structure. Part of this was to make sure we really understood the issues, we understood the business, we understood the challenges that they were being faced, and we wanted to clarify what was going well, because again, things had a pretty negative tone because people just felt bad most of the time, but some things were working well, but we also had to get clear about what was inhibiting team performance. And then we used this data in a number of ways. We started, and to me, it was one of the most important applications, was to create a shared view among the senior leadership team, not just among the global entities or just around capital services, but around Hyundai in general, about what the opportunities for improvement were, to have that common ground or a common starting point about what the challenges were. And that was able to better align the senior team around actions that needed to be taken. In addition to that, it provided a benchmark so that we could measure and evaluate progress, but also evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. Were we actually moving the needle and improving performance overall? And the information was used to design the solution and to customize our materials, because part of this was a training or a meeting solution. So we were focused on sort of 2 prongs. We wanted to get its skill and knowledge, but we also wanted to get its structure. So one of the most important outcomes from the interviews was that it wasn't just about cultural differences. They were definitely there. They were definitely important. They were definitely having an impact. Because again, those of you who may be familiar, Western Korean culture, very, very different. And Korean culture is not like Japan, not like China, very unique, very different, creating some real problems in terms of how people engage and interact. But there were also structural issues, right? So in addition to the lack of clear roles and decision authority and the poor communication, that lack of shared goals became clear. Now, again, it's not that people weren't aware, but we were able to articulate it because we were able to say, this is a consensus among the group, and here's the kind of impact that it's having. So we were able to really get more a common view about the impact of the lack of shared goals and the lack of standardized processes, because everybody was doing everything their own way. The handoffs were very awkward, very difficult, very time consuming. So we kind of, again, two prongs. We had training sessions, and you could call these work sessions, because we brought in senior managers from each of the regions. And again, initially, they wanted to just have the entities come in, managers from around the world, but not Korea. And based on the data, it became clear that you had to have a mixed group of people from all parts of the world, including Korea, sitting around the table talking about what they need to do to improve performance. So we had skill building activities, problem solving conversations focused on real world issues. So we had some case studies, but we really wanted them to focus on problems that they were currently dealing with. And I'll show you a little bit more about that. So this is the agenda for the training session. In a similar way to what I've done today, we talked a little bit about benefits and challenges, and we used a case study. This Nike's global women's fitness case really fit them very nicely, because it captured a lot of the issues that they were actually facing, but it allowed them to talk about it in sort of a neutral kind of safe ground, but it helped them identify best practices. So it wasn't, I avoided lecturing and saying, this is what you need to do. I basically let them discover and then talked a little bit about the research after that. So then we covered the 4 prerequisites, because, you know, interesting, you get to it if you take a look at the case studies, identified the 4 prerequisites, but then had them do a self-assessment. Using our grid survey, they were able to clarify the extent to which factors were in place that support cross-functional teaming, areas that needed attention, and actions to close gaps. So they would then get into small groups to share their results and to actually talk about what they were going to do about it. And in the first group, we had all the senior managers, so they were really key decision makers. The second and third groups and fourth groups, we had kind of lower levels, but the first group was really able to make key decisions. And then we moved to the trust side, to the skill side, and we focused on 3 key skills. We focused on building and sustaining trust. We focused on influencing without authority, on interpersonal communication skills, and involving others in decisions. And in each one of these, there was a self-assessment where they had a sense of getting a better sense of their personal preference and style. And we used that as the basis to talk about what they need to do differently in order to build trust, influence, and communicate effectively. So we focused on the skill side as well. As a result of the sessions, people were able to not only identify, but agree on what the current state was. So what we were doing was building a broader consensus about what's working, what's not working, to better understand the challenges that each of the units was facing. So it's not just about their problem, but it's how the problems in each group was creating a problem for the team overall. We laid the groundwork for building trust among matrix partners, where we could then open up communication. We started to talk about how to gain support for ideas, even though you might not have authority over them, and this whole emotional intelligence to be able to work more effectively, active listening, empathy, a balanced response to enhance. So we laid the groundwork and started to apply those skills overall. In addition, and this is sort of in parallel, we consulted with senior leaders, and the whole idea was to be able to discuss the structural issues and be able to make some recommendations to enhance collaboration and to make cooperation desirable and feasible across boundaries. Because again, a lot of organizations just encourage people to cooperate. You know, come on, we're on the same team, let's go, you guys. And most people want to, but when you don't have shared goals, clear roles, etc., even their desire to do it becomes much more difficult and much more frustrating. So it takes more than encouragement. You really do need to make it feasible and make it desirable for people to do that. So what were the outcomes? HCS opened discussions with the Motor Group. and they really started to have a difficult, tough discussion about aligning goals and addressing the mismatch between production targets and the requirements of sound loan-making practices. Each group had to understand the drive and needs of the other and how they relate to each other. HCS and headquarters reorganized. They had a fairly significant reorganization that streamlined and the structure. It improved transparency and communication. And as a result of that, it made it clearer who the global entities needed to contact. It took a lot of layers and noise out of the system. And when each, so you could improve the overall speed and the quality of decisions and overall trust, because now people understood who was asking. Again, in the Korean culture, you don't always know who's asking. Someone's asking, but it could come from any number of people. But now it was much clearer and transparent who was asking and why they were asking. They clarified roles and decision authority. They assigned the task of laying out the RACI grid for the organization to an individual. It was a dedicated role, and they did it right. They really started with the key decision makers, cascaded down through the organization, and they included all the players. Their early version of the RACI model didn't have everybody. It just had the primary roles. You needed to have everybody involved so everybody knew what they were supposed to do. And the simplified structure also made it a little clearer around and made it easier to determine decision authority, reduced the confusion, miscommunications were also reduced, and they stopped wasting a lot of time and resources on day-to-day activities. And managers, leaders now had the skills they needed to build and sustain collaboration. So the face-to-face meetings, managers gained an understanding of the Korean culture, and we really did have a segment just on culture because it is a factor, and they focused on improving their soft skills in that context. Plus, we did it two-way, so the Koreans also had a chance to understand the Western culture a bit more and why there was tension and friction, and be able to apply the skills. So all in all, they were better able to understand and influence each other, gain commitment, gain cooperation, and work through problems that arise kind of day to day. All right, so we have a little bit of time for questions, but if you are interested in more information about working effectively across organizational boundaries, in my book, Closing the Execution Gap, which you can get on the HRDQ site, or you can get it on Amazon. There's a chapter that's dedicated to working effectively across organizational boundaries, but also on my website, onpointconsultingllc.com. We blog on the topic all the time. We have an ebook on that topic that you can get easily, and it's all free going forward. So with that, Sarah, I'll turn it back to you, and we'll take a few questions if people have any.
All right, perfect. Yep, thank you so much, Rick. That was great. We do have a little bit of time for some questions, so attendees, go ahead, shoot those into the questions box. And we actually have a few right now. The first one is coming from Lauren. Is a matrix structure appropriate for all businesses, both private and public sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it really doesn't matter. You know, even for-profit, not-for-profit. It's this is really about having multiple functions able to work well together. And in any type of business, and any again, public-private, profit, not-for-profit, the matrix structure will both speed things up, allow you to get closer to the customer, allow you to address multiple issues simultaneously, get economies of scale. There's a lot of benefits to it for any business overall. So yeah, absolutely, it's appropriate in all structures.
All right, perfect. Next question. Why did Hyundai Capital bring in a third party to help, and how long did the process take?
Yeah, they brought a third party in. I guess there were two reasons. One is, and it goes back to, there was disagreement over about what the best thing to do was. and they didn't feel that they wanted to bring in what they considered an expert in this area around the credibility side of things, and there wasn't really agreement on the best way to do it or the best way to achieve the result they wanted to. So they thought a third party would be more objective, and they thought they'd have credibility around saying, this is what you need to do, or these are some things you should consider trying. So how long it took, the most time was around scheduling the programs, because the data collection, really didn't take very long at all. It took a couple of weeks to do the interviews and present the results. And we customized our standard program. So we had sort of a program in place, and we were just sort of mixing and matching and moving pieces around. And we had to look for a case study, so we didn't have to develop a case study. So it really just took a few weeks to get that in place. The most time intensive was the scheduling, getting everybody's calendars around. They ran the programs in Seoul, so everybody had to fly out there, which was a good idea doing it there, because it really immersed everyone in the Korean culture, which really was an important aspect to get a better feel. And they had an opportunity to see the company. Like, a lot of people only knew their own little area. So they went up to visit the motor group to see the manufacturing site. So it gave them a better perspective. But the specific answer is, let's say 6-8 weeks to get everything up and running.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Rick. Next question is coming from Karen. Which of the prerequisites do you feel is most critical to success?
Oh, yeah. Well, they're all important. I mean, with the caveat that they're all important, if I had to pick one, I think the primary one is the shared goals, because I think it's the shared goals that lay the foundation for being able to resolve the other issues. So if you've got shared goals in place, then the desire to work together, to cooperate, to collaborate, to overcome obstacles is much, much stronger. So then when it comes time to try to, communicate, be more transparent, work out roles, it's easier, or at least more straightforward. But the shared goals, and then next would be the clear roles. I think those are, and decision authority. I think those are key.
All right, perfect. Moving along, our next question is coming from Mike. We've had difficulty getting agreement on standardizing work processes. What can we do to make that work for all parties?
Yeah, again, and that's also a challenge. So I think a couple of things about that is, make sure you've got the right people involved. Having shared goals is a great start, right? Because then people are more willing to even think about changing the processes. But it also helps to focus on the touch point. So rather than change the whole process, you change the parts where there's the handoff, or in other words, what format do we need the information in? I like to collect it and array it in a certain way, but when I give it to you in that format, it's not that useful for you. So maybe I still do my work the same, but when it comes to arraying the information before the handoff, I'll make some adjustments to accommodate the way in which you take the input in. So focusing on the touch points, I think, can help a great deal. But again, having shared goals opens people up much more to take a wider look at their processes. And if the positioning is overall work improvement, overall efficiencies, not just to make the team work better, but to improve the work process within your own function, I think that can be a good incentive for a lot of people.
All right, wonderful. We are out of time, but I know we did not get to a few questions. So I'm going to go ahead, scroll up through that questions box. We'll be putting those into a Word doc, sending those out to Rick, and then he'll be sending those back to us, and then we'll be sending those out probably about mid next week in an email. So Rick, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and just wrap up then for today?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, again, I think it's the idea of it takes more than just skill, and it takes more than just encouraging people to work effectively across boundaries. Some time does need to be devoted to taking a look at these 4 prerequisites and ensuring that they are in place, or the teams have the capability of putting them in place in general. And of course, there's a lot of information on my website. onpointconsultingllc.com. And thank you all for joining us today.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Rick, again, and everybody on the line. We appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thanks all. Bye.